And Arnie, if you can hear me, would you mind just pinging Joe? I'd love to just get him on camera to make sure everything looks and sounds okay.
Will do.
Thanks. Welcome, Dan. How are you?
I have very little voice.
Okay, well then I won't call on you to lead any sections in a surprise manner.
That would be good. Thanks, Sophie.
Are you feeling okay, or do you sound worse than you feel?
Well, I've had this cough since before Christmas. And I never felt bad except for the cough, which has really been a racking one. But the last week I've felt pretty de-energized. I think it's taken its toll on me. So it's been more than a month.
Oh,
But yeah, anyway, I'm not the only person. There's probably going to be other people on this call who are also struggling with this cough, whatever it is. So
lingering,
yeah,
yeah,
what's going
relentless,
on?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi there, Joe. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to make sure I can see you. Can you do a little talking?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep, sure can. So I'm going to
Okay,
update your name to E3, and our colleague here, Will, is the one advancing slides. So when you want to go to the next slide, you can just ask Will to help you out there.
great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Yep.
Philip, have you been spared whatever cred is going around? Oh, you're muted, but there you go.
Yes, mostly, but both of my kids have had it. So, in fact, my son just went back to school yesterday for the first time after about a week and a half, which is great because it's just about finals next week, right? But then there's a snow day today. So, yeah.
Why did I think snow days? I thought that there was snow days were a thing of the past with virtual learning.
That's what I thought too, but apparently not.
They're a winter's gift, so I know that it's a pain in the butt for parents and caregivers, but I remember as a kid there was nothing better than a snow day. So welcome, Summer. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Trying to stay warm, I guess.
Yeah, I'm just gonna rename you real quick if that's okay, or at least put your affiliation there with AWEC.
Sure, thanks. Sorry about that.
Oh yeah, you're fine. We were comparing winter bug notes. Have you stayed relatively healthy, or have you caught what's going around?
No, I've stayed pretty healthy, thankfully.
Great. Hi there, Joel. Welcome.
Afternoon.
Joel, I'm just gonna add UTC to your name if that's okay. There we go. All right, well, we will get started in about 2 minutes here. Everything is already live streaming to YouTube. So that's taken care of, and we're looking forward to a good meeting today. Let's give everyone a minute to finish their lunches or start their lunches off camera, and we'll see everyone in a minute. Great. Welcome, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm doing well, although it is a very cold and drizzly day out there. I was helping out at my kids' school this morning, and then we took our car in for a service, and so I had to walk back up in the rain and forgot my umbrella, but I'm warmed up now and ready to go. So
And you're in West Seattle as well, right?
yes, yep. Mhm.
our pipe burst in our house last night, and apparently this whole West Seattle, because it's so hilly and the water pressure, apparently we're like the #1 spot for burst pipes. So if you want to have another #1 attached to where you live, you can feel proud.
I'm sorry to hear that, Sophie. What a mess.
Yeah, it's okay. We're figuring it out. And welcome, Jim. For some reason, I thought that you weren't going to be able to make it, but here you are.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I indicated wrong on the calendar invitation. I have a conflict for the March meeting.
Oh, got it. So Rose will join in March. Okay, great. Thanks for being proactive about that. Oh, welcome, Fred. How are you?
Pretty good. The lights have stayed on here, fortunately. We've been through and really bad in Eugene right now. 30% of their customers are out today.
Ooh.
So we fortunately, you all fortunately missed most of what we've been through, except the wind. But it's been really tough for PG and PAC.
I bet. This is, sometimes my naivete about how weather systems works, but I usually feel like Washington is hit harder with snow than, I guess, the Portland area, but yeah. Okay, so it looks like Ezra's having trouble finding a link that works. I'm wondering if, Pauline, can you just double check that he has one, and then maybe just directly send him a link?
Yes, will do.
Okay, great. So Pauline will help out on that front. Thanks, Stephanie. And welcome, John. How are you doing? Are you staying warm enough in Corvallis?
I am kind of. My power went out earlier today, so I'm still I've not yet ready to abolish the ski cap. It is still necessary in my office. It's pretty cold in here. It's a good place for a wine cellar right now.
Okay. Well, we didn't want to tell this to you, but we actually controlled the weather in order to have these peak chilly days just for this resource adequacy conversation. So as a facilitator, I am all powerful, and we line this up perfectly. So we're looking forward to this conversation to happen. Waiting for Ezra to join. It sounds like he got the link all figured out. Let's bring him over here. Very good. Okay. I'd say that we can get going, and then, if we're able to end a minute early, that wouldn't be so terrible. And yeah, let's get going, because I know some of you have calls at 1 o'clock. Very good. So welcome to your January 17th RPAG meeting. Thank you for those of you who attended last week's meeting and this week's meeting. We know that's asking a lot of you, and we really appreciate it. Very good. Froy is able to join. You can go to the next slide, please. So as usual, the webinar features members of the public, the attendees here. You'll be able to raise your hand once we get to the public comment. Otherwise, the Q&A is turned off for the public, as well as the chat's turned off for the public. And that's just really to kind of mimic what a real meeting environment is for these kinds of advisory groups. If captioning helps you, please go ahead and turn that on. Next slide. So our safety moment, many of you have experienced cold temperatures, might be tempted to turn on those space heaters, but just make sure you keep them away from flammable materials. Don't put them on top of furniture, near water. Don't leave children unattended near them. And don't plug in a space heater into an extension cord, which I did not know and quickly changed. So very good. And welcome, Kate and Katie. Thanks, good to see you here. You can go to the next slide. So my request is always just be courteous. My job is to make sure that to balance the need for inclusion, but also timeliness, so we don't kind of infringe on the rest of your day. And for members of the public who are here, thank you for being here, for paying attention to this process, and we'll be sure to get you at the end for your public comments. Okay, next slide. So our agenda today, resource adequacy kind of is the main topic, but I will kick us off with my colleague Emily discussing a little bit about the convening assessment that we did with most of you, and just kind of the findings and whatever next steps are there. So those are the two big topics. You can go to the next slide. So the main speakers on the resource adequacy topic will be Joe Hooker. He's joined by Arnie Olson. They're both from E3. And so they'll provide the bulk of it. And then on the PSE side, I think you're both familiar with Jen Colson, who's the manager of operations and gas analysis. And Philip is here, doesn't have like a presenting role, but will share some remarks and is just available as he always is for comments. And as you know, he's a director for resource planning and analytics. I can go to the next slide. So with that, I actually want to turn it over to Philip just to share some introductory remarks, and then I'll get going on this thematic summary. Go ahead, Philip.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you all for joining us on this chilly day. This, as Sophie mentioned, this is a great time to have a discussion about resource adequacy. We did hit new peaks for both the electric peak as well as our gas throughput over the weekend. I mentioned in our last meeting, which was just last week, about the load forecast, that we were looking forward to having some real cold temperatures to really test our equations. And glad to report that we were really, really good. The load forecast for the temperatures that we experienced were right on track with what we forecasted. So it's good to have that dialed in. The grid was stressed out, kept the lights on, high loads. Not surprising if you've been listening to what happens to weather systems in the region. Had very, very little wind output, almost none during significant amounts of time. But the whole system stayed up. The one thing that we did do on the gas side is we did curtail our interruptible gas customers. So we've just never had very many interruptible electric customers to speak of. But on the gas side, that's quite a large amount of load. So those were cut. We did have the LNG. We have two of the LNG peakers, both at Gig Harbor and Tacoma. LNG were both running over the weekend to keep the pilot lights lit. So fortunately, everything stayed up. So that's we also just want to mention before we get into the presentation that we had we just had this meeting on the load forecast last week, so we don't really have the feedback report to report out on at this point. So yeah.
Thanks. I see Fred's hand. Fred, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. And of course, there was also the incident or whatever at Jackson Prairie, which
Right.
we heard from the news was resulted in about 50% or more, 50 to 70% outflow, curtailment of 30 to 50% for a few hours on Saturday. I have to say, when I heard that news, my heart sank, because I know, how important that resource is for the Puget Sound region and really for, all of us. I guess I'm presuming there will be a lot more, to say about that in the future. But actually, my question is actually, and maybe this is just something I've wondered all along, for the gas power plants in the region, were any of them curtailed by the pipeline during that period?
Ours were not. I don't even know that. I don't know the answer to this, but I don't even believe we had to go on backup fuel. I'm not 100% sure about that one. But none of our plants did. We have firm pipeline capacity for all the combined cycle plants. So all our combined cycle plants were fine. I believe all our peakers were just fine as well.
Okay, that is also something I wasn't clear about. So you do have firm gas for the combined cycle.
Yeah, because they don't have backup fuel. That was sort of part of the way we've looked at it for resource adequacy is if you don't have backup fuel, then you better have firm fuel supply.
Right, of
So,
course, it's a trade-off on the cost, but yeah.
Well, especially since we're winter peaking, right? If we were a summer peaking utility, maybe that would be different. I don't know, but maybe it would feel a lot different. But yeah, we need the gas at the same time. So
yeah.
Well, and presumably you also that way we're able to avoid the really high gas prices we have right now. It's running around 20 a million BTU at the moment.
Yeah, that definitely helped.
So
like I said,
all this, I say all this is relevant to today's discussion about resource adequacy.
Yeah, we're going to definitely.
I think it'll be very interesting to find out more about Jackson Prairie and the role that it plays in the planning, not maybe for today, but to come back to that because it's such a big resource. And, mist over in the Oregon side is not quite as big. But, I think it really alerted me once again to our dependence on gas, especially in these extreme weather conditions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fred. Emily, if you just want to jot in the notes, just a recommendation to come back to the Jackson Prairie question or comment. So make a note of that. Okay. Well, Philip, was any other kind of setting the stage remarks before we share a little bit about what I was able to hear with this convening assessment?
Nope, that's good. Thank you.
Great. So we spoke with the vast majority of you over the holiday season. So thank you for finding time amidst lots of family time and what else you had going on. And this is really typical of the role of a neutral third-party facilitator so that we really can be an advocate for the process and then you all at the process as part of the process. So my colleague Emily and I, we're going to walk through kind of what we heard in our conversations that we held about some of your goals or concerns regarding the new RPAG, as well as I'll wrap up with showing you the updated charter. And we have to just kind of, as a group who's ever here today, just say, is this something that you all are comfortable moving forward with? So you can go to the next slide, Will. So like I said, met with 10 members. One we weren't able to get a hold of, but I think now we'll chat with them, but their remarks won't be included in here. And I mentioned those other 2 points earlier. So you can go to the next slide. So our firm named Triangle Associates has nothing to do with the triangle of satisfaction, but I find that I use this as a framing point all the time, which is a lot of your comments and concerns could really fall into 3 buckets. And so what makes you satisfied with the process? Issues around content, issues around process, and issues around relationship. And it was really interesting that the majority of your remarks to my colleagues, Emily and Pauline and I, have to do with process. So we're going to linger there a little bit longer. And the way these slides are set up is that we're highlighting for the full group here items that 2 or more of you shared. So when it rose above the line of an individual comment, we're sharing it with you verbally in your slide deck. And I'll just ask Pauline to drop a link to the slide deck to today's meeting in the chat. In the appendix of this, there are all the individual comments as well that we wanted to just kind of have on record, but that's not what our focus is going to be at this moment. So you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily just to talk a little bit about the one content piece that came up more than once.
Yeah, so as Sophie noted, content really didn't make up the most of our conversations. We really focused on process and relationships, but there was one major theme that did come up by 2 or more folks, and that was the reciprocal nature of mutual benefit. And so wanting to make sure that while PSE is learning a lot from RPAG members, that RPAG members too can bring back information to their respective organizations and also be learning from this process.
Thanks, Emily. You can go to the next slide, Will. And we'll pause at the end for some questions. So in terms of, go ahead, Emily. Yeah.
Yeah, and then in regarding process, we heard a lot more from folks. And so we have 3 themes here, and then we have more on the following slide. And so one thing that really came up was the need for a diverse public perspective. More than 2 RPAG members noted that they felt like the people who currently participate in public webinars aren't representative of the full general public. And they felt it was important to have representation from named communities specifically. And then a second theme that came up was the need for meaningful public input. And so making sure that there's a conversational, relational way for meaningful input with the public. And so making sure that the public isn't left out of the process. And then a third theme that we heard from folks was accountability to RPAG members. And here folks really talked about making sure that PSE is listening to RPAG members, explaining their decisions, and giving feedback if feedback given from RPAG members isn't actually actionable. And I'll pass it to Sophie now.
Thanks, Emily. So the next slide, Will. Okay, this is a little dense, forgive us. But other themes that came up was that a lot of this information is really technical. And so a few of you really wanted kind of meeting materials in as far advance as possible. And we'll get to that when we look at the charter. There was also a real desire that in this kind of smaller advisory group setting with PSE, that you all lean into contentious topics. So perhaps the topics that make you uncomfortable, whoever you're representing, and also for PSE to tolerate some amount of discomfort if things are not, if things are a little bit more contentious. Another piece here that we heard was that you all are coming at this group with different expertise and different years of experience in your industry. And so you all wanted different ways of entering the conversation. So kind of like those who want the 500 level experience could dive deep maybe into some of the raw data. And for those of you who are kind of coming at it a little bit fresh, maybe to have another portal that's really more accessible and more plain language. The next piece here is we heard from a few of you that it was noticeable and important to fill that equity seat. So if you remember, PSE designed kind of a table here for you all with a seat from an environmental justice or climate justice related organization. And the outreach that PSE originally did, the groups they reached out to didn't have the capacity. And a few of you said that that really is an important hole that we need to continue to pay attention to. And a few of you took it further to say, yes, it's important to fill that seat, but just the broader question, or maybe the underlying intent, is how can this IRP kind of embed equity and thinking about social and racial equity and the impacts that resource planning can have on different communities, especially vulnerable populations or highly impacted communities. And then the next piece is just connecting concepts. So, there's going to be comments from the public, there's going to be comments from RPAG, there's going to be comments that are highly technical, there's going to be comments that are related to kind of the human dimension and the social dimension of all these decisions, and that the idea is to connect those dots and create kind of a web rather than these siloed ideas. So you can go to the next slide and have Emily wrap us up here. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, and then regarding relationships, there's two themes that came up from more than two folks. And so the first one being listening with openness, making sure that we're giving members the benefit of the doubt, that we're truly listening to each other and not creating an adversarial dynamic between folks. And then in line with that, the importance of having balanced perspectives. And so making sure that there's not just a few members that are hogging the microphone and dominating the conversation, but that everyone's sharing their voices and feels comfortable so that we can hear from everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So next slide, and then I'll kind of steal the screen sharing for a second. So I'm going to show you the draft charter in a moment. PSE accepted vast majority of the recommendations that RPAG members had on the chart, with one exception, and in the spirit of being transparent about what PSE is able to accept or not accept with some rationale. A few of you wanted to have meeting materials more than 5 days wanted materials 5 days in advance of meetings. PSE just noted that consistent with the WAC, it's going to send materials at least 3 days in advance. They did add a line to the charter that they have an aspiration to send materials even further in advance when possible, but from a commitment standpoint, it was going to kind of just stick with what the WAC had. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and show you a little bit about the charter, and then I will pause for questions because I feel like a few of you might have questions about the charter. Okay, so this green text as I walk through shows that here are different changes that you all wanted to make when I met with you, and then these are the changes that PSE approved. PSE took another look at this document since you all came together in October and made mostly administrative changes, but just in the spirit of transparency, I just wanted to acknowledge in red what they had changed. So the first piece is that in the purpose statement, you all wanted to add a line here about social and racial equity and the impacts on these named communities. And so that has been added. PSE added some language here about identifying and performing candidate portfolio evaluations. You all wanted a note here, or not you all, but RPAG member wanted to add a note about developing or helping develop these draft portfolio results. So PSE was good with that. And then PSE just kind of broadened it from IRP development to resource planning. Other notes here is just an intention about why 10 to 12 members. We came at this process saying it's not going to be a hard and fixed thing, but what is the reason why? Well, it's hard to have an organized, cohesive group conversation with more than 12 people. That's just kind of something I've experienced as a facilitator. Other pieces of it, a number of you had questions about the conflict of interest section. And so, you know, you wanted to say that people with a known conflict of interest may be asked to excuse themselves. And then PSC made a recommendation that we're not mind readers. So if you feel like you have a conflict of interest, a little bit of the onus might be on you to raise that and to recognize and come to me as a facilitator and say, I think I have a conflict here, and excuse yourself. Scrolling down, I know this process stuff is not why all of you get up in the morning, but I appreciate you bearing with me. A number of edits around PSE commitments. One change here is that PSE will be accountable to sharing how RPAG and public feedback were used or not used in accordance with the WAC. Otherwise, you know, provide you all at the start of the meeting with the synopsis of feedback from public webinars. That's exactly what Philip did last Friday. There was no public webinar between Friday and today, so he didn't do that again, but that will be a routine. And then, as I mentioned here, you know, PSE will aspire to provide materials earlier than that. The choose your own adventure kind of comment translated into the charter by saying, how can we tailor information to support you all? You all have different types of levels of expertise. And then a request here to really tie the level of engagement. So are you all kind of informing a process, or is there more of a collaboration happening? Just again, being clear and managing your expectations, and so that you can know what to expect from PSE and how to hold them accountable, which is connected to this thing called the International Association of Public Participation Spectrum, which we added as an attachment. Just an administrative cleanup here with not calling it electric energy, but just electric and gas. An RPAG member recommended striking this because just a feeling here that it seems like PSE was going to use the RPAG, or RPAG in some ways was responsible to having PSE meet its legal obligations, but PSE is just, regardless of the RPAG, responsible for meeting those obligations. Yeah, and then you all wanted to have just good relationships. So there was a comment here about being aware of meeting time, and you know, if there's things that are coming up, you all have each other's phone numbers, I hope, and you can connect with each other. Small comment here, and then we're almost done, which is some of you have small shops where you have to kind of have floating positions. So we're looking for you to assign an alternate. It can change over time. It doesn't have to be the same person. Again, from the relational perspective, you all come from different backgrounds, but really just the idea, this is a pretty unique environment to go out of your usual sector conversation. So to share those pieces, PSE added just a note that if you can keep your camera on whenever possible, it makes it again feel like a meeting in the olden days, you know, pre-2020, just to see your faces. There was some conversation about when would an RPAG member be asked to either leave a meeting or leave a meeting or leave the group altogether. And so we kind of spelled it out that, you know, if it crosses the line into personal attacks, discriminatory language, harassment, that sort of thing, that's what crosses the line. Having a controversial opinion, that does not cross the line, but when it becomes an attack or really incivility. So all work, I doubt this will happen. But you all as RPAG members wanted just a little clarity about when that line might be crossed. And so, yeah, a note here about work plan items being having input from RPAG members. PSC made a note here about it's not just about clean electricity planning, but electric and gas planning. And this was just unnecessary language. If you're an RPAG member, you're from an established organization. A number of you talked about not wanting this to be a talking heads, but a conversation. So part of my job is to uphold that and find ways for you to do more talking and less listening. Yeah, and so if you're a member of the public, the polling, if we ever do polling, just to respect that the polls that we're going to provide RPAG members are for RPAG members. Lastly, a few of you were open to in-person meetings, but some of you live far away, or some of you have childcare commitments, or who knows what. And so we'll always have a virtual option, even if one day there's a public meeting. So with that, I just want to stop sharing, look around the room. Do you feel like the assessment captured what you shared with us? anything comes up, let's start with the assessment and then we'll turn to the charter. How's this landing? And welcome, Elisa. I didn't see you initially. Hello. Comments or reflections on the assessment? I see a thumbs up. I see a hand from Dan. Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Thing come off of mute. There we
Did
go.
I actually raise my hand? I didn't know if I did. I just, yeah, thumbs up. That's basically all I was going to say. So thanks. Looks good. Lands well. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Anyone? Oh, hi there, Lauren. Welcome. All right. Any other thoughts or feedback on the assessment? The point is so that we're starting off a process with your needs being out front. So any needs we didn't capture here? Well, in the interest of getting you to your technical stuff, since I know that's what you all live for, there's no voting. It's nothing formal. We just need a moment in a meeting summary that says there's no objections to this charter, and that's what we'll use to kind of operate moving forward. So I'm just going to ask the question, do any of you have any objections to you all using this as your charter? Okay. Hearing none, no objections from John or others. Well, Emily, you can just note in the notes that there were no objections. You know, this is not the US government. It's not a constitution. If something needs to change down the road, let's talk. That's fine. But I just wanted to make sure we have a common groundwork. So thank you all so much again for meeting with me and my team. I really enjoy getting to know you individually. And I'll just note that for our work plan for this coming year, our hope is that maybe at the end of the year, so in like 11, 12 months, we can just check in with you again to see how it's going. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Will and to share the screen, and we can get into the resource adequacy conversation. So please go ahead, Jen.
I'm actually gonna have Philip, I think you want to say. Oh, no, you didn't, did you? Okay. Few words. We already did. Okay, just kidding. So hi, I'm Jennifer Colson. I'm a manager of operations and gas analysis responsible for resource adequacy. If we could go to the next slide. I wanted to kick off the conversation before we hand it over to E3 to kind of just talk about PSE's resource adequacy analytics, where it's been and where it's going. I am under the impression that one of your first questions will be, what are we doing about the RAP? So just felt like we should just address that up front. And since the RPAG is new, I thought it'd be helpful to just kind of reorient everyone on what we did for the 2023 Electric Progress Report, and then talk about what we're doing this time and where we see ourselves going. In 2023, for the Electric Progress Report, we kicked off the resource adequacy analysis with E3. This was following an independent review from E3 through an all-source RFP in 2021, where they identified areas of improvement for our resource adequacy analysis. So in the 2023 Electric Progress Report, E3 took that on and made a number of improvements and changes to the modeling process and leveraged their model called RECAP that Joe will discuss in a few minutes here. And of course, at the same time as timing never is our friend, RAP also produced forward showing metrics for their capacity sharing program. And it was a non-binding program, but they produced a summer and a winter number kind of right around the same time we had draft results from E3 for the progress report. We attempted to use those RAP metrics and do kind of a comparison with the portfolio. Unfortunately, once we were diving into it, there were a number of just assumptions we would have to make because those RAP metrics really weren't meant for long-term planning. So we ended up not doing that, unfortunately, and we just moved forward with the E3 analysis. And then fast forward to today in the 2025 electric IRP that we're working on, we wanted to make some improvements. So we're starting with the E3 recap model again, but this time we're actually going to produce an LLE metric, which aligns closer to the RAP because that's the metric they leverage, as well as zonal ELCCs for the generic resources. So in the prior analysis, the generics were very specific, and so this time we'll move to the zonal framework to align better. Concurrently, while that was going on, we were really excited because we got the RAP to kind of kick off a long-term planning metric working group, I guess you'd call it, under the RAP framework. And so we were excited to have that moving with an hope that we could leverage that work for the 27 electric progress report. I know it's confusing because we're only in 25 and I'm already talking about the next one, but that's how long this stuff takes. So unfortunately, that was canceled at the end of last year due to some conflicting prioritization with getting the actual program up and running since they haven't had a binding showing yet. So that's been postponed. So where we are for the next and where this moves forward is kind of unknown at the moment, but we do have every intention of following up with RAP members in those conversations in that long-term working group. There were a number of different utilities that were very interested in joining forces and figuring out a path forward for that. And it's really, we think, and those other utilities agreed, it's really important that we find a way to leverage those RAP metrics for long-term planning so that we align, as close as we can to operations. So we'll continue to work on that. I don't have a fun update for you today, unfortunately, but that's the plan going forward. So I just wanted to let you know our process there. And so on the next slide, just also wanted to orient you on the timeline for this resource adequacy analysis. So we're here, at the beginning of Q1. It's already almost late January, which is wild. And we're talking about the methodology and overview. And then you can see I flagged on here the RPAG meeting on March 12th, where we'll talk about the results from the resource adequacy modeling. You may be wondering, how is that happening so quickly? It's because we did start this work back in the summer. Unfortunately, timelines, again, aren't our friend, and the RPAG was not stood up yet. So to help us with that, we did reach out to a number of you and actually kind of show the same presentation. So hopefully for some of you, this is a repeat. And for the newer members, we just really wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to get up to speed on where we're at with the methodology and the approach. So we can be on the same playing field. You will notice a few changes because, things evolved over time. It does take time to run this resource adequacy analysis. So that's why we had to start when we did, to align to the electric optimization model timeline to produce those results for you in September. Another good thing to call out on this timeline is that September date. Once we have a reference case from Aurora, we'll pass that over to E3 and they'll do a backend check. And we feel this is really important for the portfolio because essentially the front end, when we have those draft results, they're using PSE resources to build that planning reserve margin. But then they're filling that hole with, random generic resources, and resource adequacy is not an economic model, right? It's a extreme event capacity model. So when we look at a portfolio that's actually been optimized in Aurora based on all the parameters we have to optimize to, clean energy, costs, all those things, it produces, a number of resources, and it's important to go back into recap and make sure that we're truly meeting the planning reserve margin. And if we're not, then it gives us an opportunity to go back and make some tweaks in Aurora to ensure that we're doing so. As Philip mentioned in the beginning of the meeting, and Fred as well, resource adequacy is a very important topic across the country and the Northwest today, as we're seeing capacity shortfalls. So that's a really important thing that we do on the back end. I just wanted to flag that for you. And I think that's kind of all I had. I was going to hand it over to Joe from E3.
Jen, can we just take a pause? I think we wanted to just pause between speakers. Any questions or comments from you all on what Jen has shared so far? Go ahead, Froy. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm interested in maybe for transparency and just for all of us to be on the same page. For those of us that are not as familiar with what the RAP was and how is that different from the methodology of looking at the LLE or ELCC values moving forward. Maybe again, just speaking from the teaching seat as an instructor of these kind of topics, maybe for the rest of us, would be nice just to have a little primer of that again. And yeah, maybe that's my ask.
Yeah, I did think that question might come up. So, so Joe's gonna dive into the different planning reserve margins and the different methodologies. So the LLP versus LLE, you're probably like, why do you keep saying those words? Stop it. So he'll describe why those are different and how those are different. I did think, so we actually had a really good like educational on resource adequacy in the last IRP where we had RAP come and explain what they did. And so it's recorded and it was, we'll get you a link, but it was August 24th of 2022. And I think you can just fast forward to the RAP and they'll overview their whole process. But essentially it's a very different methodology and approach. The way they're using their loads and their hydro and everything is different than how we set it up. Because they're looking at an operational near-term forward showing and we're looking at long-term planning. So it's just a different approach in how they're modeling those. They also don't have, I think they only went out a few years, whereas we're going out 20. And the big thing with resource adequacy, which Joe will talk about, is really the saturation. So once you get a large volume of different resources, the effective load carrying capability of those resources really starts declining. And that's really important in those later years for the portfolio, especially. So hopefully that is helpful.
I mean, I teach this topic, so I'm pretty familiar with this. I just want to have like a background so that everybody can go back to them and say like, oh, they're talking about ELCC. What the hell is that? But this is good information about the RAP presentation that I wasn't aware of. So this is good. Thank you.
Yes, and yeah. And what we're planning to share today is pretty like foundational. So I hope that you'll leave feeling like you're on the same page.
Or your students or whoever's watching, or your facilitator, for instance, who is just trying to play catch up with all this stuff. So thanks for that request, Roy. And in the chat, I think you may have seen that there's the link to the video that has a lot of this kind of foundational pieces. Any other questions or comments for Jen? Okay. Well, Joe, do you want to come on camera? Great. All right, well, I think you can go to the next slide, Will, and then Joe, if you want to take it from here, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, everyone. Really happy to be here for this discussion today. My name is Joe Hooker. I am a director at E3 in our integrated system planning practice area. I work a lot with utilities doing long-term planning across North America. Focus a lot on portfolio analysis, resource procurement, as well as resource adequacy, which is the topic for today. I'm joined by Arnie Olson, who's a senior partner at E3, so you may hear him chime in as well. And E3 provides consulting services to utilities, government agencies, developers across North America on a range of topics related to the energy transition. And as was mentioned earlier, our role in this process is really supporting the resource adequacy analysis. And we also performed, as Jen mentioned, we performed this analysis for the 2023 Electric Progress Report as well. And so this is really a refresh of the analysis that we have previously provided based on updated information. So if you could go to the next slide. I'm going to start by just giving some high-level overview background on resource adequacy just to set the stage, and then we will dive into all the specifics for the methodology for this specific analysis for the 2025 IRP. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about resource adequacy? You can see that NERC provides a definition here on the right, which is really short and sweet. Resource adequacy is the ability of supply side and demand side resources to meet the aggregate electrical demand, including losses. So as you all are experiencing, and many across North America right now, it's very cold and the electric systems are being stressed right now. And so when we talk about resource adequacy, we talk about making sure that there are enough resources for times like these to ensure that there's enough supply to meet all the demand during these extreme periods. For the PSE system, it's winter peaking, but summer, of course, is also another important period to be planning for. We saw in 2021 with the heat dome event, the temperatures getting really high and electric demand increasing significantly. And so in our analysis, we look at both seasons. We perform a winter analysis as well as a summer analysis, and that's what feeds into PSE's planning. So to summarize, all of our analysis is really feeding into the IRP to ensure that PSE, when it does its long-term planning, there are enough resources to meet reliability needs during summer, winter, during really extreme periods, but really all hours of the year is what we're looking at to make sure that the system is resource adequate. The second point I wanted to make on this slide is that there's really no way to avoid all resource adequacy challenges. You can't avoid everything. And so the industry practice is to develop standards, which then utilities use for planning purposes. And the most common standard across North America is to plan for what's called a 1 day and 10-year standard, which means there can be up to one loss of load event or shortage of resources event during 1 day every 10 years. So really making sure that those shortage events are really rare and far and few between. And for this analysis in particular, as Jen mentioned, we're actually going to be looking at two different reliability standards. So PSE has historically used what's called a 5% LOLP standard, which stands for loss of load probability standard. And essentially what that means is that there can be 1 year with a loss of load event every 20 years. So only 1 year where there are insufficient resources during just one time at any point during that year every 20 years. And that's the standard. That's the historical practice. As Jen mentioned, the RAP process uses what's called a 0.1 LOLE standard, and that LOLE stands for loss of load expectation. And the way that standard is defined is that there can be up to one loss of load event every 10 years. And that's kind of what we're seeing as sort of an industry standard emerging. There is really no single standard across the industry that's required for all utilities. It really changes across different jurisdictions. But that's kind of what we're seeing as emerging as somewhat of an industry standard.
Joe, does it work for you to just, I see that there's some hands. Can we just kind of make it conversational?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Let's start with Lauren and then we'll go to John. Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, John might actually have the answer to my question, which was, how does this compare to what the council's doing?
John.
Well, first, I would probably need to ask my question to check, but I suspect it is similar to the council's historical resource adequacy standard of 5% loss of load probability. And the reason my hand was up, however, I will say, just for the record, we are kind of in the process of changing the metrics we're looking at. One of the metrics that we're looking at in the future is a 0.1 loss of load expectation standard as well. So we're looking to move to like a multiple metric way of assessing resource adequacy, looking at both frequency, duration, and magnitude. And so there's a few other metrics involved here, but for where the council's going, I will say, you can't all know exactly where the council's going because we haven't finished our process yet. So to be fair, the previous standard was a 5% loss of load probability standard. And the one clarification I wanted to ask Joe was, is the loss of load probability, the way you folks are looking at it, is it there can be multiple events in that 1 year every 20 years. I just wanted to clarify that it's not just one event. It's kind of the standard way that the council's looked at loss of load as well. Is that right? So when you're talking about the LOLP, okay, great.
Yeah, that is right.
awesome.
So it's 1 year every 20 years. So there can be multiple events within that year, whereas the LOLE is defined based on events. And so it's really, if there are multiple events in a given year, that all counts towards the standard in that way.
Excellent. Thanks. Lauren, did I answer your question? Just so since we're playing tag here.
Yes, thank you, John.
All right, thanks.
And I'll just note as we're talking through acronyms, something PSE is going to start doing again is have an acronym glossary at the end of each slide deck, especially for members of the public. So didn't get to do it this time, but stay tuned. Go ahead, Elisa. I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I had to find the unmute. I'm using two screens. Curious about the definition of an event. Is there a threshold for something to be an event? I've seen that as other utilities saying, you know, an event I won't count unless it's above, you know, a certain duration or certain size or something like that.
Yeah, so for us, an event is really anytime there's a shortage, no matter how deep or how long that shortage is. And just to add to that, it's not just about meeting the instantaneous demand from customers, but there are also reserve requirements on top of that that the utility must hold. And those reserves are really important to make sure that, you know, it's not just, we don't have something catastrophic across the entire system. We limit it to really, just shedding, smallest amount of load possible. And so when we talk about there being an event, that means that the utility cannot meet the instantaneous demand plus those reserve requirements on top. And so any shortage of that, we would qualify as an event. And that's the industry standard.
Got it. Thanks, Joe. How about you, Joel?
Yeah, thanks. My question is just about how the 5% LOLP and 0.1 LOLE will be applied in the context of planning. Is that, will a portfolio, for example, only be considered adequate if both of those are met? Or is one sort of the primary, they're just a metric to track, or how will that be applied?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so historically, PSE has just used the LOLP. This time around, we are looking at both, but we are looking at them in an independent manner. So we're looking at what would the requirement be if you met an LOLP standard. PSE will do analysis based on that. And then we're also looking at what would it be under the LOLE, and PSE will also look at that. We're not looking at a scenario where you're adding them together, but rather looking at them separately like that. And then in terms of how it gets applied and whether PSE requires portfolios to meet that, I think that might be a good segue to the next slide, actually. So maybe I'll answer that, Will, if you advance one.
Yeah, Joe, before you go into more detail there, I was just going to note for the good of the order that, there's lots of people in the industry thinking deep thoughts about what metrics should be used and what standards should be used. Everyone kind of recognizes that 1 day in 10 years is fairly arbitrary, just as like 5% LOE. Well, why not 4 or 5.5? Lots of deep thoughts, no emerging consensus yet on something that's better than 1 day in 10 years. But there's lots of literature and lots of stuff happening in case anyone really wants to dive into this topic.
So I just wanted to jump in real quick. And what we've done in the past is looked at, at the 5% loss of load probability, what do these other RA metrics look like if we hit the 5% LLP, right? So we'll kind of be paying attention to those. But I think what we're really planning on looking at is these will be RA metric scenarios. So we're going to ask the question, if we use the RAP type approach, right? So we use 1 in 10 LLE. That will give you a different planning reserve margin. It'll give you different ELCCs for resources, right? So if you have multiple metrics, you kind of you can't really do anything with all of those multiple metrics. If I need one to put into the portfolio model, you got to have kind of one. So that's really where we were going with this, was to kind of take a look and say, okay, if LOLE, if we're shifting over to the RAP, eventually we'll be moving over to the RAP. I think that's going to be really important. Our hole is so big, we need to get to a simpler RA approach to filling this hole. When we get closer to having when you're close to adequate, then this kind of really fine tuning makes a lot of sense. The RAP will help us get to that point. But big picture, I think we're thinking about it as like these will be scenarios, basically. What if we shifted over to 1 in 10 LOLE versus if we kept at the 5% LLP, but certainly tracking the other metrics along the way. Does that help, Joel?
Yeah, I think that helps me understand what the approach is. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks everyone for the comments. This meeting doesn't have like set discussion questions that we're planting. And so I just really appreciate everyone just kind of jumping in and getting your voices out there. Joe, carry on.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. So I think this gets to the second part of your question, Joel, which is in terms of planning towards that target, how that's achieved. So this is the industry standard for how all of this information is ultimately ported over to the portfolio analysis model, which PSE will be running. And so there are really two major components: the planning reserve margin, or PRM, and then effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. So we run our model to ultimately quantify a planning reserve margin, which tells you how many megawatts of resources are needed on the system to satisfy the reliability target. And so we essentially translate that reliability standard, whether it's 5% LOLP or 0.1 LOLE, to what's the total number of megawatts needed on the system in order to ensure that that target is met. And so then that planning reserve margin requirement goes into Puget PSE's model as a constraint. And then the model has to add enough resources such that it is meeting that constraint, satisfying that PRM. And the industry convention is to quantify the PRM as what's the amount of megawatts above the 1 in 2 peak load, or median peak load for the utility, that's required to meet that reliability target. And you'll oftentimes hear it in terms of a percentage, where it's the percentage of that PRM megawatt requirement above and beyond the 1 in 2 peak load. So that's kind of the demand side, how many resources total are needed to ensure reliability. And then on the right-hand side is the supply side. What resources and how much do they contribute to that total requirement? And the effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, it's a very jargony term, but really all it means is how many megawatts can the resource be counted on towards contributing towards that total resource requirement need. And we talk about it in terms of perfect capacity equivalent. So if you imagine a perfect capacity resource, let's say 100 megawatts, totally fictional resource can be available at all times, up to 100 megawatts, no matter what. That is essentially the yardstick by which we are measuring the contribution of all different resources. We're quantifying their contribution relative to this perfect capacity resource. And then that ELCC for all the resources is what determines how much they contribute to the PRM. And then ultimately what PSE is doing in the portfolio analysis model is stacking up all the resources and making sure that the total megawatts across all of them match to what that total PRM requirement is. And I'll just add that what's shown here is totally illustrative. These bars are not the right size, but it's really just a picture to give you an idea of how all this works. And so PSE has, of course, many resources on the system. As Philip mentioned, the system does need more resources, and so that's what we reflect there as that shortfall bar. So there is a gap currently between the total need and what resources are currently on the system. There's load growing over time, and so the portfolio analysis that PSE is doing is really identifying how do you fill that shortfall to ensure resource adequacy in the future. So I can pause there to take a question from Fred.
Yeah, go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, and apologies because I have to jump off right after this, but I'm wondering your thoughts about energy efficiency and how that fits into these various metrics. In the sense, energy efficiency, it's always there. It's not like resources that have outage, et cetera. The value of it goes up and down because, among other things, people turn appliances off and on. The heating and cooling is weather sensitive, obviously. But one of the things that the Power Council, and John can talk about this, has really looked at carefully is the value, the kind of the resource adequacy value of energy efficiency. And I'm wondering what thoughts you have on that and how you think it should be assessed.
Yeah. Fred, you cut out for like 4 seconds. Joe, did you get the gist of the question? Okay.
Yeah.
Apologies. My internet here is not very good. We have
You're
resource
fine.
adequacy issues with that too.
It's a different meeting. Go ahead, Joe.
So absolutely, I agree that demand side resources like energy efficiency help with meeting resource adequacy needs. And as you mentioned, Fred, each energy efficiency program or measure is different. Some, lighting obviously has a certain shape in terms of when it's reducing demand, or appliances based on when they're being used, or if it's building shell, that's very weather sensitive. And so each measure really differs in terms of when it helps the system. In terms of how we're incorporating energy efficiency, any existing energy efficiency measures that are in place today, that gets factored into the load forecast, which then factors into our modeling. And so that incorporates the timing, shapes, differences across those different measures. In terms of future energy efficiency measures, we do not bake that into the load forecast that's going into our model, because that's actually a decision as part of the portfolio analysis. And so I think I'll hand it off to someone from PSE if they want to chime in more on this. But the portfolio analysis model will look at different bundles of energy efficiency measures when determining what resources to add in the future, and looks at that side by side with the supply side resources, and looks at the contribution of those resources, those programs rather, towards contributing towards the PRM there.
PSE, anyone want to jump in? Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, I can jump in unless Jen, would you like to cover it, Jen? I can defer to you if you'd like.
You got all the buttons pushed. Go ahead.
Okay. So what we've done in the past and what we're planning to do this time is we're basically giving the conservation there's no reduction in the peak capacity value of conservation, right? There's no forced outage rate. We're probably being a little overly generous with conservation because there is a lot of uncertainty with conservation. You don't know how much you're going to actually get. You don't know how people are going to react. You don't know what they're going to do with their behavior at the time. But whereas you've got at least on some thermal units, you've got at least a forced outage rate. You've got ELCC, ELCC offsets for other types of resources. We're giving conservation that full sort of capacity credit. So that's what we've been doing. I think you could easily do lots and lots of additional work to dig into that issue, but we were kind of planning on that's kind of what we were planning on doing at this point. Yeah.
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
Yeah, just quick follow up just to make sure that I'm clear. So it would broadly have like an ELCC of 1 or 100%. Yeah, okay.
Plus then when you don't have the load, you don't have the reserves either, right? So
right.
you get quicker as well. So
okay. Okay, I may have a comment later, but I will forego it until I see more details. But thank you, Philip.
Okay.
That's good.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Philip. Yeah. All right. Okay. How about you continue, Joe, and then we'll pause again in a bit.
Yeah, sounds great. Let's go to the next slide. So this really gets to the high level methodology, and then the next slide will be much more detailed on how all the data flows in and where it's coming from and all the changes in the 25 IRP versus the 23 electric progress report. But high level, what our model is doing is we have a 3-step process for performing this resource adequacy analysis. So step 1 is to really characterize what is all the ranges of uncertainty that we could expect in the future. So for a given model year, let's say 2030, which is one of our model years, we look at what are all the different conditions that we could expect to happen in 2030. And so we simulate the year 2030 many, many times under all different possibilities for what we could expect to see in that year. So we simulate about 1,000 years for the model year 2030, and we look at how could load vary, if there's a cold snap like you all are experiencing right now, or heat wave in summer, or maybe it's a mild year. We look at all those different conditions. We look at renewable output, how it could vary across all different weather conditions. So solar, look, if there are clouds or not, wind, how's the wind blowing across all different areas where all the wind resources are located. It's not shown here, but we also look at for resources that can have forced outages, like thermal resources or battery resources. We look at the potential for forced outages for those resources going offline and remaining offline for a certain amount of time. And so we have all these different simulations to really understand when can there be issues for the system and what does that look like, and what's the total number of megawatts of resources that are needed such that we can limit those loss of load issues to within the standard. So that's step 1, really just characterizing through statistical means, simulating the system over hundreds of different years for a given model year to understand what the range of outcomes could look like. Step 2 is to quantify the total number of megawatts that are needed, and so that really comes down to that requirement or reliability planning standard that's being used. We'll be looking at it the 2 different ways. As we mentioned, we'll be looking at it for LOLP and LOLE. But essentially, our model will add enough additional perfect capacity to the system until the system reaches whatever that reliability standard or target is. And then that amount of additional perfect capacity that's added to the system, that will determine what's the total megawatt need for the system in order to ensure resource adequacy. And as I mentioned before, the planning reserve margin is often expressed in terms of a percentage. And the way that's calculated, we take this total resource need, or TRN, in megawatts, divide that by the 1 and 2 peak load and subtract 1. So it's really the percentage above and beyond the 1 and 2 or median peak load for PSE system. That's how we're quantifying the PRM percentage in the end. And then that goes into PSE's portfolio analysis model. The final step here is to quantify the effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, of all the different resources that PSE is looking at potentially adding in the portfolio analysis model. And the first point I want to mention is just that no resource is perfect. And so every resource has an ELCC less than 100% because no resource is a perfect capacity resource. So even, firm resources that we call firm, like natural gas, they do have forced outages. And we do account for that when quantifying the ELCC of those resources. Likewise, I think renewables, very intuitive that they're not always available at 100%, depends on the weather. And so, but, that doesn't mean they don't have no contribution. They do have a contribution, and it depends on how their generation profiles coincide or don't with the times of need for the system for ensuring resource adequacy. And then energy limited resources like energy storage or demand response, they also have limitations, usually in terms of duration for both, but then also number of calls for demand response. And so there are limitations there that also limit the contribution of resources in terms of their ELCC. And so we essentially look at, for each of these resources, we add it to the system and look at how it helps meet the reliability standard and how much perfect capacity essentially can be offset in the system. And we do that for every single resource for which we're quantifying the ELCC. We also do it at different penetration levels. So I think Jen mentioned this earlier, but looking at the first, megawatt addition of a resource, you'll get one ELCC value. But if you add many more megawatts of that same resource, you will see what we call a saturation effect, where the ELCC of those subsequent tranches of that resource will go down. And one of the easiest examples to think of is for solar. If you add, let's say, I don't know, I'll throw out a number, 2,000 megawatts of solar, just totally hypothetical example, you probably aren't going to have any issues in the middle of the day in terms of resource adequacy challenges after that point. And so when you look at adding that 1 megawatt beyond 2,000 megawatts, you're going to see a really low ELCC, because now your resource adequacy needs are no longer in the middle of the day. They're now, been pushed into nighttime, let's say. And so we see that saturation effect for solar, for wind, for energy limited resources like storage. As you add more and more of these resources, the ELCC of subsequent tranches of those resources does go down. And so we quantify what we call an ELCC curve, which expresses that relationship between penetration level and ELCC contribution. I'll pause here. This is our last kind of intro background slide, and then we'll spend a lot of time on the next slide, which really takes a deep dive on the methodology for the 25 IRP.
We have plenty of time in this meeting for your questions and comments. So anything else? Go ahead, Froylan.
Yeah, Joe, do you model hybrid systems, solar battery, or wind battery, or other, intermittent resources with battery, and how do they compare ELCC wise?
Yeah. So PSE is modeling hybrid resources as part of its portfolio analysis. And so we are evaluating the ELCC of hybrid resources as well. And I think there are a few parts to my answer. So I think first and foremost, it really depends on the configuration of the hybrid resource, kind of what it's going to look like. It also depends whether resources are kind of coupled behind the same inverter or interconnection. For example, one thing I see a lot is, let's say there's a 200 megawatt solar resource and a 50 megawatt battery resource that are part of a hybrid system. That's 250 megawatts of total resource capability, but they may be sitting behind the same 200 megawatt inverter slash interconnection capacity. And so in that case, compare that to if you had 200 megawatts of solar on one part of the system, 50 megawatts of storage on another part of the system, that shared interconnection is actually a limitation on those resources. So if you had a need when, let's say solar output's high and you need the battery to be discharging, you're limited at that 200 megawatt interconnection. And so that limitation can actually reduce the ELCC for hybrid resources a little bit. On the other hand, I do want to acknowledge that there are, we call them interactive effects or synergistic effects between, let's say, solar and storage, where if you add a lot of solar to the system and storage to the system, the contribution of all of that is higher than if you only added that solar to the system or only added that storage to the system. You get this kind of synergistic effect where the solar helps you during the daytime. It kind of narrows your nighttime need, and then the limited duration storage can help with that. So that's an effect certainly that we see in our modeling if you do add a lot of renewables and a lot of storage. But in terms of, hybrid resources, I guess to get back to your question, we are looking at it. There are complexities around that interconnection issue. And then this synergistic effect, you won't really see that in a big way if just adding, like one hybrid resource, for example. But if you add large quantities of these different resources, there can be interactions between them as well.
Does that help, Roy?
Yeah, it does. I mean, in my mind, and this is obviously a methodology question, hybrid systems maybe are a little bit of a broad sort of definition where you have some batteries and intermittents sort of talking to each other or, relating in a constructive way perhaps. But yeah, if they're behind the single sort of limiting, inverter, then I can see the point. Yeah, that there's just so much that they can provide to the grid at times of need.
Yeah. I'll just make the general point that a hybrid resource is always going to be, it will never be better than two resources that are independent, that have the same characteristics. It'll always be either equal to or less than if it has some limitations, like an inverter limitation or a charging limitation, for example. So part of the challenge with these type of projects is to capture the interactions between, let's say, solar and batteries at the system level between independent solar and storage resources accurately, but then also to capture what those limitations are for a hybrid system so that you're not tilting the scale one direction or the other when you're modeling a hybrid system relative to solar and batteries independently.
I mean, I'm really sort of trying to pick your brains here because in long-term planning modeling, this is sort of an interesting, difficult issue of how do batteries interact optimally in the procurement, or when do you save, when do you discharge? It's not so trivial, I guess.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. And we have a lot of material that we published on that as well. So if you want to reach out, maybe after, we can point you to some things that we've done on that. And you're right, it's not trivial. Yeah, and we have in our mind a way to do it optimally, but the realities of software and modeling practices, almost nobody actually does it optimally in their planning.
Arnie, if you wouldn't mind just dropping your email in the chat, just so that in case Roy wants to get in touch.
Oh, sure.
Great.
Happy to.
Let's hear from you, John.
Yeah, I just I also kind of wanted to just share that to Ferlin, like that we struggle with this at the council in the last plan. We also tried to do something like a similar sort of approach to what PSE is doing. Is a little different because we're doing regional planning. But we tried to model hybrids, and broadly we were seeing a similar sort of thing to what Arnie said, which is that if you have two separate resources, they very rarely, like if you're let me put it this way. So my caveat is if you're not considering the locational value, it's very rare. Like I can't imagine a situation where two separate resources wouldn't be more valuable than one together. The locational value is the only piece. If there's some sort of transmission deferral where potentially having the fueling of the battery, say the solar in a particular site, that could potentially do it. But again, that's getting into like Arnie was talking about, the perfect analysis, and sometimes that will make your models run a very long time. And so these sort of methods, I think, require, I mean, we struggle with this all the time, require a significant amount of computation because there's so many iterations that you're doing to try to do this adequacy analysis. So just all a balance there, I think, on trying to figure out what's the right level of fidelity for the answer you're getting. You're really trying to take these high level metrics. So just, I don't know, just some context. I don't know that I added a lot. I just wanted to share. We've also struggled with this.
Thanks.
All right. Do you want to move on, Joe? And then we can always pause after your next slide.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so definitely planning to sit on this slide for a while because I think this does a good job of just laying out all the pieces that are flowing into our model, how it's interacting with PSE's analysis downstream. And as I go through this, I'm definitely gonna spend some time talking about the differences between the 25 IRP analysis versus the last iteration we did for the electric progress report. So first, just orienting you, this goes left to right, and the colors, the blue is PSE analysis, and then the tan is E3 analysis or outputs. And big picture, that the recap box, that's our loss of load probability model that we're using to quantify the PRMs and ELCCs. And then portfolio analysis is really the main show for the IRP for selecting resources. So starting on the left, at the top left, I'll talk about all this data that's flowing into our model and just call out a few points for each of them. You can see that there's a lot of data that flows into our model. And then ultimately to produce the PRMs, ELCCs. So first at the top with load, we have the base load forecasts for PSE's customers, and that is updated for the 25 IRP. And as I mentioned earlier, that includes any demand side resources that are kind of currently implemented, but it doesn't include any future demand side resources, and that's because PSE includes those as options as part of the portfolio analysis. So it's not baked in upfront in our analysis. It's evaluated as a supply side option in the portfolio analysis. New this time around is that EV load forecast. So we did not have that in the last iteration. And the EV loads, are meaningful. We're looking at the years 2030 and 2035. And so we do see meaningful loads from electric vehicles by those years. One thing I wanted to just call out on the EVs is that what we're plugging into our model is an unmanaged charging profile. And then PSE will be evaluating managed charging and how that can contribute to resource adequacy needs as part of the portfolio analysis. So that unmanaged shape will push the needs higher in our analysis, but then the ability to do managed charging will be an additional supply side resource in the portfolio analysis, which can help to mitigate that. Going down to the second row here, what we've labeled market. So this captures the market interactions between PSE and the rest of the Pacific Northwest. And the key model that's feeding this information into our analysis is the Genesis model. We are using the classic Genesis model, which is similar to the 2023 Electric Progress Report. We also are factoring in information, not just from Genesis, but really also the load side for 3 climate models. So we're modeling 3 different future climate models consistent with the council's analysis, which are 3 kind of different scenarios for how climate change could impact the Pacific Northwest. And we're doing all of our analysis for those 3 scenarios. Genesis is really informing our modeling in terms of what's happening at the regional level in terms of resource supply balance and whether there are shortages at the regional level and when. It's also informing when the hydro is producing. The one thing I did want to call out, though, which is different from the 2023 Electric Progress Report, is for Genesis, we are now using runs that have the region at a 5% LOLP reliability level. So the last time around, the region was short or didn't have additional resources to kind of bring the region up to that target. And so we saw a lot of shortages or insufficient supply at the regional level in our last analysis. Now it's 5% LOLP, and so we don't see as many shortfalls at the regional level. So that is a change this time around. That Genesis information boils down to really 2 key inputs. One is the hydro budgets. So we do have flexibility that we model at some of PSE's hydro resources. So PSE has capacity at 5 of the mid-sea hydro resources. And so we do model the hydro budgets for that on a daily basis and factor that into how much those resources generate. And also we do capture some flexibility to be able to kind of flex up or down within a day at those resources. And then we also have hydro budgets for Upper Baker, Lower Baker, and then Snoqualmie isn't really a hydro budget. It's more run of river. Then the other arrow here going over to WPCM, that is PSE's wholesale purchase curtailment model. And so what that's doing is basically taking any shortfalls at the regional level and downscaling that to PSE's system to characterize, to basically tell us when are the periods when PSE cannot import from the market because there are insufficient resources at the regional level. And so that's what that model is doing. It also informs, we have this reserve sharing box here. PSE is part of a reserve sharing group, which means that it can lean on its neighbors if there's a shortfall in its own system for providing operating reserves up to an hour. And we allow PSE to do that anytime the region is not short. So if the region's short, we assume that PSE can't rely on the region because the region's short. And so that also factors into our analysis. So our model, based on the Genesis outputs, ultimately, our model determines when can PSE import unspecified imports from the rest of the region and when is the hydro available to generate. The last area here on resources, and then I'll take a quick pause to see if there are any questions on the input side. So we model all of PSE's resources, all of the existing resources, I should say, that are contracted or planned to come online ahead of 2030. We did make a few modifications versus the last time around that I just wanted to call out. One is that we've removed, or we are no longer modeling the exchange with PG&E. So PSE has an exchange by which PSE gets energy from PG&E in winter and sends energy in summer. We're no longer modeling that, assuming that that's no longer there by 2030. We also, different from last time, we now have demand response resources as part of the existing portfolio. And those resources contribute in both winter and summer, north of 100 megawatts. There's also a new wind project, the Vantage Wind project, 90 megawatts, which we've now added on to the portfolio. And then the last one that I wanted to call out is that we are now modeling increased capability, hydro capability at the Wells, Wanapum, and Priest Rapids dams, which reflects PSE's latest contracting with those resources or agreements. And then the last major input is the shapes for solar and wind. So those are the same as last time. We have 250 years of simulated profiles for solar and wind at all different locations across the West that are being modeled as part of this analysis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. I see you have your hand up, John, and I said I would pause after going through the inputs, so.
Great. And just for John and Joel to note that you have an RPAG member on the phone and a member of the public on the phone. So if you're like referring to visual things, just don't be like the next one, just spell it out. So go ahead, John.
Thanks. Sorry to be talking all the time, but yeah, apologies. For those who know me, they know that this happens, and I haven't been able to stop it since I was a little kid. But anyway, I'm really excited about this stuff.
It's fine, John. It's a small group. Go ahead.
Anyway, yeah, question about the Genesis. Kind of there was something about the setup that you said, so that that the Genesis information, you said that it was not at a 5% LOP, like kind of with the initial information. I was wondering, how did you bring it, or perhaps I heard that wrong, but if that is what you said, how did you bring it to a 5% LOP?
So I'm going to have to quickly hand it off because I'm not the person who brought it up to 5% LOLP. And yeah, just to reiterate what I said before, the 2023 EPR was not at the 5%, and then this time around it is at 5%.
Jen, go ahead.
I'm not the person that did it either. I'm hoping to get an answer. So maybe we could go to Joel's question and come back if that's okay. And maybe I'll have an answer. Okay.
That sounds good. Go ahead, Joel. We'll get back to you, John.
Thanks. So two questions. One, with greater reliance on inputs that correlate with weather and climate, I'm wondering if anything has changed between the 2023 Electric Progress Report approach and this approach in terms of the data you're using and the correlation between weather inputs for the load forecast, for example, and what's used for solar and wind shapes or hydro. I know that that's like kind of an industry-wide gap in data sets, so I don't know if that's something that you've done or not, but just wanted to see if anything had changed.
Mm-hmm. In terms of future climate data being used across load, hydro, renewables.
And, describing an internally consistent future, if it looks like a rainy year in terms of solar production, does it also look like a rainy year in terms of hydro production?
Yep. No, really, really good question. In terms of the underlying weather data that's being used across the board, so the load and market data is based on the 3 climate models that I mentioned earlier. Those outputs are the same as what was used for the 2023 Electric Progress Report, so there hasn't been any updates to those. And then on the solar wind side, that as well as the same as last time, but I do want to call out a difference there, which we have acknowledged is a gap, which is that the solar and wind is not using this exact same weather data as the 3 climate models. It's based on it's basically, I mentioned earlier, it's 250 simulation years. It's based on synthetic forecasts based on a historical period of observation of solar and wind data. And so we don't have those lined up to the exact same weather data as the climate change data. So we have the synthetic renewables based on historical, and then we have future climate based on number of climate model runs. And so ideally those would all be matched up and synced up. But that's kind of a barrier that we have faced in terms of being able to line those up, because the solar and wind is all based on historical. We don't have that on the climate change data.
Thanks. And then my second question was about the sort of timing of this. In the meeting last week, some RPAG members expressed interest in hearing more from Guidehouse on their EV forecast. And I was just, wanting to see kind of when you all at E3, need the final inputs to run your recap model based on the timeline for the 2025 IRP.
Yeah, go ahead, Philip. It seems like you might have an answer.
Yeah. So Joel, we're not anticipating that we would take this, the updated EV forecast and run it again, pay E3 to run that this updated load forecast in the RA models. That we'll be able to handle that just fine in the portfolio modeling, right? So it'll scale to the extent that the load is higher. There's a PRM that's going to get scaled up, right? The planning reserve margin is going to get scaled. The energy will get scaled. So we weren't planning to do an alternative RA analysis, like we were with the LLP versus LOLE. Not planning to do that with the EVs. We've certainly thought about it, but I think that we all need to expect that the EV forecast is very uncertain. Right, it is really going to waggle around quite a bit. So that's what we were thinking about it, Joel, is that we're not planning on kind of running it through the RA analysis, but to the extent that we have less EV load, there would be less sort of potential from the conservation potential assessment. So those are linked. But in terms of the RA modeling, we weren't planning to do an additional load scenario. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Let me just repeat what I think I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong. So it sounds like the EV load forecast that E3 will use is already decided, but the PRM that comes out of recap will scale up just to whatever the final load that goes into the portfolio model looks like. Is that the approach?
Yeah. So if the planning reserve margin is 15%, it's going to be 15% on top of a lower load. If we use the lower EV forecast, it's going to be 15%, but on top of the lower peak demand. So the PRM itself isn't going to be a function of EV, but the capacity required will be a function of the EV forecast. Did that make sense, what I just said?
I think I'm understanding what you're saying, and it'll take a little more time, I think, for it to sink in and think about.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a
what I
couple,
Very good.
just on the EV piece, a couple things to clarify. So the presentation on Friday, that load forecast is the load forecast that E3 has moved forward with, the one with the larger EVs. And then the question, right, was that EV change. And so, but if you kind of zoomed in on the graphics that they showed, I talked with them about it quite a bit. And so the 2030 timeframe, the delta in the EVs is kind of noise. So we didn't feel like it was impactful enough to this resource adequacy analysis to stop everything and wait and adjust that because of the small delta in that study year. And the 2030 study year is we value more than the 2035, right? Because it gets more theoretical over time. So that's another reason why we really have been deciding to move forward just as is to prevent future cascading effects of delays.
Yeah. Jen, while you have the mic, I just want to go back to the original question that you were huddling up with your team on.
Yeah. Yeah, so we had a consulting analyst a couple years ago when we started this work with E3 in for the 23 electric progress report who retired, unfortunately, and then that's how E3 got the job. So in doing so, he set up the Genesis, classic Genesis model for us and created a way for us to kind of manipulate the LOLP. So essentially they took the curtailments from the Genesis and subtracted the added capacity, and they did that until the system was balanced. And they did that for each climate model. And I know we had a lot of back and forth, John, about classic versus new and all of that, but that was done before that. And so once we decided there wasn't enough variability in the new Genesis, and we had to use classic, then we manipulated that to make it align a little bit closer to what you were showing in new Genesis with that power plan. So if that helps.
Okay, I think it helps. So it sounds like maybe it's just, well, maybe if I'm understanding correctly, it's you use the ELC. So you had in the classic Genesis, it was basically a not adequate system, and then the ELCC studies were done in a way to make it an adequate system, and that's how you evaluated the capacity credit, or is it just? I was trying to understand the order of operations. If you started out with sometimes when you conduct like an ELCC study or do something else, you start out with an inadequate system. But I was kind of under the impression that might happen in one of the E3 tools rather than in the classic Genesis, since you're just using it for hydro budgets. And I was wondering if the region in general was adequate. And I guess my general thought is I just was interested to know if it was like if you just use the plan to make it adequate, because like when we plug, well, anyway, when we plug the power plant in, that we get an adequate system. That's that, and I was just wondering if it was something consistent with the plan, or if it was there were a few other tweaks that you had to do independently because of the vintage. But let's take this offline. I don't want to go too deep down a rabbit hole. I just wanted to ask about that. Yeah.
Yeah, we can definitely follow up in more details with you.
Thanks, John and Jen, and thanks, Roy, for sharing some more resources there. We have 12 minutes till our observers have a chance to speak up. So maybe Joe, just carry us forward till about maybe 1:45, and then we'll wrap with questions.
Okay, that sounds good. So I covered the left-hand side of this, which is all the inputs going into our model, which is really the bulk of this slide. What's on the right-hand side is really, I think, largely recap of what we've already been discussing. Our model, we're producing PRMs and ELCCs, and for the PRM, we are doing it for 2 study years, 2030 and 2035. We're doing it for 2 seasons, summer and winter. We're doing it for the 3 climate models, and then we are doing it for the 2 reliability targets, LOLE, LOLP. And so essentially, multiply all those numbers, that's the total number of planning reserve margins that we'll end up quantifying. Ultimately, what we feed to PSE, what gets fed into the portfolio analysis, the 3 climate models, for any one of these runs, we do average the results across those 3 climate models in order to produce a single PRM number, which PSE can use in Aurora. And then, as Philip mentioned, the reliability targets, that's kind of more of a scenario approach, and then the seasons and years apply to, the different years and seasons. On the ELCC side of things, we are quantifying ELCCs for, as I mentioned, thermal resources, solar, wind, energy storage, hybrid resources, demand response, and as we mentioned, we are also generating saturation curves or ELCC curves like we did in the electric progress report. The one thing that I did want to maybe underscore on ELCCs that I didn't spend much time talking about earlier is just that there are interactive effects between different resources. So one that we highlighted here is between different energy storage resources, like batteries, pumped hydro, long duration energy storage, demand response, even EV managed charging. They're all providing similar-ish services to the system in terms of helping to meet a shorter duration need in terms of resource adequacy. And so while we will be calculating the ELCCs for all these resources separately, it will also be important to account for the fact that there are interactions between these. If you add, let's say, tons of battery storage, the ELCC for demand response will go down because you've now essentially addressed the peak needs, which is when demand response would be helping you. And so those interactive effects are important to consider. The PRM's ELCCs, as I mentioned earlier, will feed into Aurora. The PRM is a constraint. The ELCCs inform the model in terms of how new resources could help fill the need. And then Aurora is ultimately determining which resources to add. Obviously, not just for resource adequacy, but resource adequacy is one of the considerations as part of that model. And then, as Jen mentioned, we will be circling back after portfolios are developed as part of that Aurora analysis. We will be doing a reliability check on the back end to check how the reliability is for that and confirm that we are, in fact, meeting the reliability targets that we set out to meet with the PRMs in the first place. So I think we can go to the next slide. And this is the last slide and a pretty brief one. As Jen mentioned earlier, we have made a number of changes this time around to try and align more with the methodology for the RAP. In addition to doing the LOLE scenario, we are also looking at modeling resources in specific zones. RAP has defined a number of load and resource zones. And they are still working to determine the final zones for variable renewable energy resources, but we have gone forward with these zones here as the zones for which we're modeling resources. So for the first column on the left, these are all the wind resources that we modeled the last time around. There are abbreviations for British Columbia, then Washington West, Washington East, Montana Central, Idaho, Wyoming East, Wyoming West. Really the main change versus last time around is that we're combining the two Montana resources into a single zone for quantifying the ELCC of those resources. And then we're combining the two Wyoming zones into a single Wyoming zone for which we're doing the analysis. And so for the Montana resources, we're taking an average of those two profiles for quantifying the ELCC of a generic Montana resource. And then for Wyoming, we're averaging those two Wyoming profiles to come up with a ELCC for generic Wyoming resource. And then that's for wind. For solar, we didn't model all these zones for solar last time around. So what we'll be modeling for solar is zone 2, Western Washington, Zone 3, Eastern Washington, Zone 5, Idaho, and then Zone 6, Wyoming. Those are all the solar resources that we modeled last time around, and we'll be modeling those same resources this time around. So yeah, the only change here is having that Zone 4, Zone 6 being a combo or combination, and trying to align more closely with RAP ultimately. So that's all I got, right under the wire.
Yeah, Joe, fantastic job walking through a lot of information. I'm just going to start with anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a comment or raise a question. No pressure. And remember, the feedback form, and Pauline, can you just drop the feedback form link in the chat, is also an opportunity to ask a question or make a comment after the fact. I'll just see anyone who hasn't spoken up. Okay. Well, then open it up to the group. Any other final questions or comments for Joe or Arnie or PSE in general? Did we exhaust you enough? Yeah, go ahead, Freud.
Yeah, and I do wanna just, yes, Sophie, please, if there's someone else, I can step back. I did have a question about, does the model assume a sort of fixed transmission system, or are transmission considerations sort of a completely different part that doesn't have to do with reliability concerns at this part of the assessment? And I don't know, Joe or Arnie, or maybe even Phil, I don't know. And
yeah, we do factor transmission into this analysis. It's not a full topology reflection, but we do capture limitations to be able to import from mid-sea. So we capture PSE's import capability for mid-sea, and there are certain resources that utilize that transmission, like the hydro resources there that they contract with, as well as a few, but not many renewable resources also use some of that transmission. And so in terms of being able to import from the market, again, unspecified imports, it is based on what is that total transmission import capability, but then that's reduced by what are the hydro units and those renewable resources doing, which utilize some of that capacity. And then on top of that, there's the question of whether there's a shortage among the larger region, which would also factor into that import capability.
Well, but then to add to that, for the resources you're seeing here, I think the implicit assumption is that transmission is being added, whether it's physical transmission or contractual transmission capacity being procured, to ensure that these resources can be delivered to Puget's load areas as needed.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Arnie.
Great. Jen, did you want to come on to add to that, or are you just getting ready for public comment?
Both. I was just gonna add, your point on transmission was a good one. And I just wanted to clarify that the RAP zones here, if you go online and Google it, these are the transmission RAP zones, and then there's like the generation RAP zones. And the reason we moved forward with the transmission was, it's really your point in your question, because we needed to dive in this IRP a bit more specifically on the transmission constraints regionally. And so that was the intention, and breaking it out this way allows us to do that better. So that's why we're using this. If you look at the two different versions of the zones from RAP, they're like subtle differences. I'm not recalling them off the top of my head, of course, because why would I? I think it had to do with like Idaho being in one spot versus the other. So it was very subtle, whatever the difference was. And that's why we chose this version of the RAP zones to align to transmission.
Anything else before I just share some next steps and open it up? No? Okay, well, thank you again to Joe and Arnie for a lot of good information, and just kudos to also RPAG members for asking a lot of really good, interesting questions. I think PSE was imagining this kind of conversation when they convened this group. So You can go to the next slide, Will. I think we've covered, let's just do next steps and then we'll wrap with their voices. Okay, so with these back-to-back meetings, in 2 days, the feedback form for the January 12th RPAG meeting closes, and we say feedback form, but it's really just feedback. So if you want to send an email to the email address listed in the chat, you can just use that email form if that allows you to add more context or writing. And then January 24th, that's when the feedback forum closes for this meeting. And so all RPAG members and observers, everyone's welcome to provide those kinds of feedback. So with that, I am going to, Pauline, can you allow participants to raise their hands perfectly? You just did that on time. I'm going to share my screen just so that I don't lose track of time here with a 2-minute timer. And I think we have Mr. Don Marsh first. So Don, can we hear you?
Okay, can you hear me?
We sure can. All right, let us know when you want to begin.
Okay, I'm Don Marsh from the Washington Clean Energy Coalition, and I've got 5 questions or comments that I'm going to try to shoehorn into 2 minutes. My first observation is that we just saw a report that after looking at 235,000 data points on Greenland ice, there's a report out today that they've found 1,000 gigatons that appears to have melted, and that is possibly going to increase risk of substantial sea level rise, which will affect PSE's, at least some of PSE's customers in the region, and also maybe even the Tacoma LNG facility in some years. I don't know what the probability of all that is, but since we were talking a lot about probabilities today, I think that's something that I hope PSE takes to heart. And for that reason, I think that we really need to look more closely at electrification and how that affects resource adequacy. So I didn't see any mention of that today, and we'd really like to see how that affects these calculations. My next observation is actually not directly related to resource adequacy, but is related to reliability. PSE sent out an email to its customers on Saturday night and Sunday morning, asking customers to reduce consumption. But they didn't mention why. I think it was related to the Jackson Prairie situation. No email has come out since then, so customers are still wondering if they should be conserving. They know now that the temperature is at least 15, 20 degrees warmer than when PSE sent out that notification. It's a concern. The next thing is it'd be very useful to know when our last loss of load event was, and also when the or how the LOLP has been met historically. That would provide some necessary context from this. I know I'm out of time, but just one other thing is you can tell by the rate of my speaking here, Washington Clean Energy Coalition continues to feel left out of this process. We can speak in the public session, but there's not the same level of technical information there, and we would really like to participate in this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those comments, Don. And yeah, comments and larger observations about what's happening around the world and region. So I think the next hand I saw was Mr. Jim Adcock. See, can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, James Adcock, electrical engineer, MIT. I am disappointed that while Puget included the E3 recommendations in the meeting notes, Puget didn't actually talk about them, just attached them as an appendix. The E3 recommendations are very good, and Puget should be talking about them here in this meeting and actually incorporating them into Puget's actions. Both gas and electric reliability are critically dependent on the reliability of gas infrastructure, including gas pipelines and storage, and that gas reliability is just not there, as indicated both by recent pipeline outages and now shortage outages. The good news is that ratepayers stepped up to make up the difference in this Puget unreliability when Puget explicitly asked us for it. But when Puget has to ask ratepayers to take extraordinary measures, that does represent a Puget failure. I hope Puget and UTC will formally review what happened during this outage and what to do different in the future to make sure Puget and other utilities actually work when the weather gets cold or hot. We do not want to duplicate Texas's outages. Puget needs to further improve their climate models. What they have done is simply a first step. Puget is not there yet. For example, those climate models have terrible regional downscaling and hourly interpolation modeling problems. Page 31. In the Pacific Northwest, we also get automatic synergy between renewables, hydrogen, and hydro, which is a huge storage capacity. E3 needs to model hydro flexibility more on a weekly basis and not just on a daily basis. Page 37, E3 recognizes the need for additional storage. Now, Puget also needs to recognize that need and to actually build that storage. In general, Puget must actually meet the clearly stated CETA requirements to actually be 80% clean in 2030, non-emitting or renewables by 2030. Finally, quote, in terms of representation of the public, historically, Puget has had the IRP stakeholders group, ratepayers who are primarily interested in environmental and humanitarian issues. Yet for this IRP, Puget has silently killed that group, replacing it with this group of only Puget's invited organizations. You cannot complain about limitations in representations of the public if Puget is not willing to listen to those ratepayers who care enough to actually show up. Thank you, James Adcock.
Thank you for that, Jim, and thank you for showing up. Speaking of someone who's been involved for quite some time. Next, we have Virginia. Go ahead, Virginia. Let's make sure we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Virginia Lohr, a PSE customer. When I moved to PSE territory, I learned that my utility burned lots of coal and had only the minimum amount of solar energy the law required. I had just retired early to devote time to fighting climate change, so helping my utility become one I could be proud of seemed like a good place to start. After years studying and commenting on integrated resource plans, I wonder if I will ever be proud of PSE. One thing that has been frustrating is PSE's inconsistent use of public participation. Over the years, PSE has vacillated between open and closed meetings. For a brief period, PSE experimented with the International Association for Public Participation guidelines in a process open to everyone. This had been strongly suggested in comments to the Utilities and Transportation Commission. Yet as soon as PSE learned that those guidelines would not become a requirement, they stopped. PSE's latest effort to avoid listening to the public is to reinstate a select group, the RPAG, and once again, not let the public have a two-way conversation. Before this latest public participation shutdown, PSE held an open meeting and broke us into groups for detailed input. One outcome was PSE saying, "We hear you, no nuclear." Yet at the last RPAG meeting, we heard that PSE is in fact investing in nuclear. Apparently, PSE ignored public input. Whoops. Yesterday, I learned that PSE does not support the proposed community solar bill, which would help disadvantaged customers. PSE said that equity is an important part of the RPAG, yet there is currently no equity representation on the committee. Once again, PSE appears to be ignoring public input. We care about equity for customers. When will PSE become a utility customers can be proud of? I'm still waiting and hoping. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Virginia Lohr. We appreciate your participation and kind of your ongoing involvement here. PSE doesn't respond to these comments. This is kind of modeled after public meetings where the public gets to have their say, and just note that PSE is sitting here listening and watching. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen and just wrap us up here just a minute before the hour. Thank you again to RPAG members, for the observers, for colleagues from E3 for this conversation. Your next meeting is going to come up in February. PSE is working hard on that. And if there's anything that comes up, please use that email address or feedback form for further dialogue or conversation. Until we see you next, stay warm. We hope this cold snap is close to being over, not only for your sake, but just for the system's sake here. So thank you all so much for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.